Now let's move on to the second mega force that's shaping the world, in the world of work tomorrow. I mean global integration. What does it mean? Well, essentially, it means the growing economic interdependence of the countries worldwide through increasing volume of trade, increasing capital flows, and through the widespread, rapid dissemination of global technology. One consequence of global economic integration is newly emerging patterns of specialization among nations of the world and of regions of the world. The industrial workforce is rapidly expanding in the developing nations and regions of the world, while the shift from manufacturing to the service economy will continue in the developed countries. This urbanization in the developing world has been underway for much of the last half century, and the trend will accelerate in the years ahead. This path is the result of a natural development, a kind of a progression which normally involves shifts of resources and production, including labor too, from agriculture to unskilled labor-intensive manufacturing, then to higher value-added manufacturing goods, and to services. Accelerated urbanization and movement of the workforce from agriculture into manufacturing and into the service sectors will undoubtedly increase the need for more and better urban infrastructures. It's a major challenge to developing worlds and developing countries. This includes everything from housing to sanitary engineering and, of course, to education and training for jobs, which is our focus today. This finally brings us to the third force, third mega force, which is shaping the global economy and the conditions of the workplace and the workforce: rapid technological change. One fundamental consequence of the process of increased urbanization is that technological change is more likely to increase the demand for skilled labor than for unskilled labor. It's a point I've made earlier. I can't stress it too much. We can think about this in two different ways. First, technological change creates shifts in the demand for some products, which in turn shifts the demand for the labor that makes those products, shifts it in the same direction. This means that the innovation of new products that serve as substitutes for old ones will tend to reduce the labor in the old sector. We've seen this many times in history. We've seen it as we've moved from typewriters to computers and so on. The second point I want to make here is that automation is, generally speaking, the substitution of machines. By that I mean both hardware and software for labor. Usually, but not always, it is relatively unskilled labor that is replaced. In general, with modern technology, unskilled labor and capital are more often substitutes for one another than complementary for one another. Now, technology and technological change obviously both destroys old jobs and creates new jobs, either in the same or perhaps in a different industry. But the new jobs that are being created by technological progress always require higher skills and more education levels than the old. Let's return to the demographics so as to judge the potential growth in the number of the world's workers engaged in industry and services. Consider this. Roughly 2/3 of Asia's immense workforce is still engaged in agriculture, compared to only 4% in the world's most developed countries, and 20% in Latin America and the Caribbean region. As urbanization and industrialization proceed in Asia, the global manufacturing workforce is due for a huge and rapid growth. By the year 2010, the center of gravity of the world's manufacturing industries will have shifted largely to what we now call the developing nations, particularly those in Asia. Roughly speaking, the global labor force may be thought as comprised of two major pools. This is an important point. Highly skilled workers, on the one hand, which form an elite group that in general have the following characteristics. Number one, they're well educated, with strong marketable skills. Secondly, they're linked by a common global culture. They're multilingual, and they generally speak the same international business language. Furthermore, they're increasingly mobile, and they are scarce. Companies worldwide are looking for this kind of talent. The second pool or group, and I speak it to some extent in extremes, but I don't overstate the situation much. The second group comprises low-skilled workers that are generally poorly educated and not very skilled. They are tied to the local culture and their own language, and they are less mobile. They don't participate in this global business culture or industrial culture or technology culture. And finally, they are increasingly abundant. The distinction between worker groups, combined with demographic developments and rapid technological change, combined with increasing global integration, carries important implications for global labor markets. And the first of these implications is, one, a fierce global competition for skilled, well-educated workers. Indeed, I read recently of a company that calls itself in a war for talent around the globe. The technological change and innovation at the dawn of the 21st century is high skills intensive, a point I've argued repeatedly throughout this talk. The reasons for this are relatively simple. Modern technology brings with it automation, which means the substitution of inanimate, non-human hardware and software for human effort, and carries that to remarkable heights. But it has, nor can it have, the power to eliminate the need for human intervention to design, to build, and to implement automated systems and to provide the interfaces between those systems and less technologically adept human beings who use them or need them. So in short, while modern technology with automation as its main component reduces the demand for human labor capable of only doing the things that it can do better or faster, this modern technology at the same time increases the demand for human talents that create it, that enable it, and to provide the interface between it and the rest of the people of the world. Inevitably, therefore, this rapidly growing demand breeds a global search for just those highly skilled and well-educated workers. The world simply is not producing this kind of human capital rapidly enough to meet the mushrooming demand. The second point is this. It concerns the emergence of a global glut, you might say a surplus, a large supply of unskilled workers. Two forces operate in the same direction here. On the one hand, modern technology makes machines increasingly capable of doing what humans have previously done, and of doing it faster and often cheaper and often better. Naturally, this reduces the demand for unskilled labor. On the other hand, as we have seen, the rapid growth of a global workforce in poorer nations that are generally deficient in education and skills creation means that the world's supply of such workers is expanding rapidly. Now, reduced demand and increased supply can mean but one thing, what we call glut. G-L-U-T, glut. The third important implication is a global movement toward greater meritocracy. Greater meritocracy in the types and levels of compensation that are paid. By meritocracy in compensation, I mean an ever closer connection between a worker's workplace performance, evaluated now in terms of what buyers will pay for the output of that worker's efforts. A greater connection between that performance, then, and the rewards paid to the worker. In other words, pay for performance. That's what meritocracy means. Greater meritocracy comes as an indirect consequence of the globalization of markets and the spread of better knowledge about market alternatives. Those two things lead to keener competition in virtually all markets. Imagine what's going to happen as electronic commerce increasingly dominates trade among companies and even consumer markets in the world. Keener competition means that employers must bid up the pay they offer to their most productive workers if they want to recruit them and to keep them. And by the same token, it means that they will only be able to offer lower pay to workers whose output is less highly valued in the marketplace. That, by inescapable logic, leads to growing disparities between the compensation, paid skilled workers, and that going to the unskilled. The better educated, more highly skilled, and more productive workers receive more. The less educated, poorly skilled, and less productive receive less. And what's the logical consequence of that? Simply put, it is lower income and lower living standards for the latter case, at least relative and in many cases even absolutely. Now my Hudson colleague, Mr. Antonio Avalos, who is with you today and who has worked extensively at our Institute on workforce issues, will speak to you about the last force shaping the global workforce, education. I'm Richard Judy at Hudson Institute. I look forward to your questions at the end of the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. I will talk about the fourth mega force shaping the workforce. Education and training is critical. Notice on this graph that educational progress has been proceeding unequally in the various regions of the world. Although the level of educational achievement has been increasing everywhere, it has risen much more rapidly in the already industrialized countries and the countries of East Asia than in Latin America and Africa. That means that the global educational gap is widening, which means that the world is moving away from a more equally educated global society. World illiteracy data illustrate the same point. The good news here is that illiteracy has been reduced in every region of the world. The not so good news is that differences in literacy remain very high among the region. Indeed, they have not diminished substantially in recent decades. This educational gap puts the world's poorer nations in a most disadvantaged position. If present trends continue unchecked, the poorer nations will find themselves with ever larger workforces that are increasingly disadvantaged in terms of the knowledge and skills required to compete in global markets. So what specifically must the poorer nations do to raise their educational levels? Well, first and most important, they must extend quality primary and secondary education to their entire populations. Basic literacy and numeracy is a sine qua non of a qualified workforce. No less important are the so-called soft skills, such as a positive work ethic, teamwork, communication skills, etc. Next in importance will be a strong vocational and technical educational system extending from a secondary school and beyond. Such a system should set adult education, training, and retraining at its top priorities. Tertiary education, like universities and colleges, are important too, but not so critical to workforce development as the others just mentioned. Nations hoping to attain global competitive advantage and prosperity for their people in the 21st century by exploiting natural resources or even fortuitous location are doomed to severe disappointment. The inescapable reality is that competitive advantage in the 21st century will hinge on one's ability to innovate, to add new value, and to respond to rapidly changing market conditions. Ultimately, this boils down to how well you produce, attract, and enhance human capital, that is, to one's workforce development system. And that's equally true for nations, communities, and companies. Workforce development, mainly through vastly improved education and training, offers the single path away from a separated society. Smarter, better skilled workforces are the keys to higher productivity, improved international competitiveness, higher living standards, and healthy societies. Several countries fully understand this and already are making maximum efforts to upgrade the knowledge and skill levels of their population and workforces. The developed industrialized countries and some of the rapidly developing nations of Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, China, for example, lead the way. Unfortunately, in the race of workforce development, too many Latin American nations are lagging behind, followed even farther behind by virtually all African nations. One of the most lamentable aspects of these lags is that they are not faded. The proper investment of proceeds realized from the exploitation of this country's natural wealth into their people is a realistic alternative for many of them. Unfortunately, that is rarely done. Can the United Nations of the World Bank help solve the problem? The answer is yes. Yes, but only at the margins. International organizations can help show the way, and they can extend technical assistance. But the main job is up to the governments, institutions, and people of the nations themselves. To end this presentation, let's quickly summarize the ideas already presented. First, rapid technological and demographic change. The global population will continue to age faster, and the workforce will continue expanding into the manufacture and service sectors. 2, modern technology is high skills biased. The development of new products requires new types of jobs, which in turn require well-educated workers. Next, global shortages of skilled workers and a global glut of unskilled workers, which means that most new workers will come from low-income economies, characterized by low skill and educational levels. Next, workforce development will be the key to economic competitiveness, higher living standards, and perhaps more importantly, social tranquility. This can be achieved mainly through education and training of the population and workforce. So, what summary picture of the world's workforce emerges from all of this? To be quite honest with you, the future remains today as it has always been, clouded in uncertainty. The potential for human improvement exists always and everywhere. But will the opportunities be grasped? Will the potentials be realized? In the final analysis, it comes down to two things. Number one, do the people of the world, especially those in the poorer nations and their political leaders, understand the line of causation that proceeds from workers' knowledge and skills to workforce productivity, to national competitive strength, to personal prosperity? Number two, is there the political will to put human resource development above all else as the central element in nation strategies for economic development? Where the answers to both of these questions are yes, then there are great grounds for optimism. Where either of the answer is no, then there are equally solid grounds for pessimism. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Judy and Mr. Avalos. Let us begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which now appear on your screen. We remind you to make your calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. Our first question today is from the Universidad La Salle in Pachuca, Hidalgo. Caller, your question, please.
Our question is the following. What do you recommend? What strategy do you recommend, and do you think it's possible in order to revert the tendency of subspecialized labor in America, in Latin America?
If I may ask for a little bit of clarification, is the question about how to take advantage of subspecialized labor in Latin America and to convert that to productive power in the future?
Skilled. What do you do with underskilled?
Oh, underskilled, thank you.
Underskilled labor.
Underskilled. Dr. Judy, if we may parry this question to you about underskilled labor in Latin America and how to move that forward into the year 2020.
Well, my first concern about the preparation of the workforce in Latin America, and it may or may not be true in every country, is that the quality of primary and secondary education, and even of tertiary technical education, is not up to world standards. That, I think, is the first thing to do, is to look to the younger generation. That problem has to be repaired immediately, so that the younger generation does not carry into the new century a legacy of poor training and inability to learn additionally. So far as the existing labor force is concerned, it seems to me that much more ample opportunity must be afforded them, mature workers, to remedy their skills and their basic learning deficiencies. And that really is only going to happen through a much more aggressive government program of providing these opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Judy. Mr. Avalos, can you follow up with that and maybe address how you take the aging component of the workforce and capitalize on their remaining productive years?
Yes, well, I would like to add that it's very important to have a efficient incentive structure. By this I mean that people need to understand that education is a good thing. Like through education they can improve their skills, of course, but also they will have access to better jobs, better paid jobs, and also they will be in touch with other people around the world that will share with them their experiences, and they will help to understand how this new world is shaping. So I just want to emphasize that incentives are very important if we want to revert this tendency.
It's very much an organic process then.
That's right.
Yes. Thank you very much for that call. Our second question today is from the Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá, the Centro Regional Colón. And the question, please.
Good morning. You have mentioned the need to prepare women both for the competitive work as for family work. Up until now, we have not prepared men for family work. Why is it that we haven't made the same emphasis for the family work for both men and women, and then have a strategy that will work for everybody?
Very interesting question. And Dr. Judy, if I may, I'm going to direct this one back to you.
Well, I agree. It's a very, very interesting question. I think very much a question of this era. I agree with the caller. It seems to me that men need to recognize that they have an equal responsibility for what goes on in the home, and to take responsibility for preparing themselves to fulfill that. So I agree with the caller's main thrust.
Mr. Brass, from a different geographic perspective, how would you provide some input on that?
Well, interestingly, from a developed world perspective, we've supposedly had the view that women, having been through their revolution, men are now going through a similar revolution. Well, in our country, in Australia, we take statistics on these things, and I regret to say that over the past 13 years, men have on average contributed an extra 13 minutes a week in the home. So I agree with Dr. Judy, that's the trend. What we did, I think, in the past was we set up compartmentalised lives. Women stayed at home and men went to work. And each of them developed themselves in those separate roles. What has happened over the last 20 years is increasingly women have gone to work, but men haven't gone the other way. And I think that is something we do need to come to terms with, as we all live whole lives rather than separate lives.
Very good, thank you. Our third question this morning comes from the Comisión Federal de Electricidad in Mexico. The question, please.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask you about the importance that of policies of openness as far as immigration for skilled workers and employees, and that we could take advantage of under these circumstances.
Mr. Avalos, can you address this one for us, please?
Yes. Well, I think immigration policies are a very important factor for all countries around the world. It's evident that capital mobility is already a fashion, but labor mobility is not the same. I can see in the future more countries opening their barriers, their frontiers, so that not just this factor will move. I'm talking about capital, but also labor. Unfortunately, many countries do not understand that they need to change their policies so the more skilled forces and also the low-skilled labor force will move freely. Hopefully, in a few years, these trends will change, and we will see people moving across countries as well.
Very good. Thank you. Let's go to our next question, which is from the Cinia Internet in La Habana, Cuba. The question, please.
Good afternoon. Undoubtedly, a very important thing in human resources lies with governments and organizations that take that give private employment as well. Do you think that the training organizations in the universities, do you think they're at the level of the rest of the world? In other words, can they meet the expectations of our times or coming times? So let's talk about study syllabi, curriculum. What do you think about that? Our curricula, are they up to date? Are they going to meet the demands, or do they also need to be updated and reformed?
Very, very good. And Dr. Judy, if you could address this one, expectations versus needs, and are we prepared to move into those arenas?
I think it's an excellent question, very well posed and very timely. Yes, I think the implicit answer here is that there much remains to be done in improving the curricula of training and educational institutions to make them more relevant to the needs of individuals and to the workplace. And it seems to me that the competitive forces are moving in a direction that may compel that. I have reference here especially to distance learning of the kind we're doing right now, but also to Internet-supported distance learning, which is bound to give the established educational and training institutions a very severe test of their ability to respond to what the needs of the day are. So I think that we're seeing forces that are going to compel those educational and training institutions that are that operate in sufficiently free markets that they will either have to respond to the needs of the working population and the training needs of employers, or they're going to find themselves essentially out of business.
Very good, thank you. A brief follow-up, Mr. Brass, if we may.
Yeah, I think there's another issue here. For so long, for most of our history, education has been about learning facts and knowledge. I think that's where things need to change. The skills that are now needed are skills of synthesis, skills of learning how to learn and making connections. And so our curriculum needs to change from simply pouring facts into people's heads to allowing them to make those connections which make them better learners.
Very good. Mr. Avalos.
I just want to emphasize that college curricula cannot improve or resolve the deficiencies of lower level education levels. So I want to add to what Richard Judy said before. We want to emphasize on lower levels of education, primary and secondary school.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for those answers. Our next question is from the Centro Internacional de Desarrollo.